Welcome to Kind of Evolved, a podcast about living naturally. My name is Drew Boniudo, and I am your host. I'm very excited for today's episode. So I had a guest on. I'm recording this after I recorded the main part of the podcast. It's out of order. That about sums up how I live my life, though. Out of order, messy, confusing. Anyway, moving on. So I had a great chat with Taylor Fossett, who's a wildlife biologist. Yeah, wildlife biologist. I got real people on here. I told you I was going to get good information from people much smarter than me. So we have a great chat about wildlife and human interaction with wildlife and humans encroaching on wildlife territory, all that sort of stuff. We cover some great topics. We go over some facts and statistics. We go over her research. We talk about different small changes you can make to your life to be more friendly towards wildlife, things you shouldn't do. And then we debunk a myth about baby birds, so you gotta stay till the end. I learned a lot from this conversation. I had a great time chatting with Taylor, so let's just jump right in. I will stop rambling. Here we go. Today I'm joined by Taylor Fossett. She is a wildlife biologist, and today we're going to be talking about human and wildlife interaction and how it affects wildlife behavior. So when I talked to Taylor originally about what we talk about today, she sent me like this 4-paragraph message that I did my best to interpret. She's going to help us all understand her work and what she does, but can you just give us a quick summary of who you are?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Taylor, and I study wildlife biology and specifically how animals respond to changes in their environment, specifically with humans and human interactions and how they influence the animal's behavior. So that's what I study. But yeah, I'm 27 and I'm about to go get my PhD at Virginia Tech. So that's the next trek. And yeah, I love wildlife.
That's awesome. It's very exciting, and it's perfect for this podcast. So basically in this podcast, I cover 2 different topics. It all has to do with nature and the environment, but we're either talking about human health related stuff or trying to respect nature and the earth and wildlife as much as possible. So in your message, you said, to quote it, you said you study how urbanization affects the behavior of urban and rural song sparrows. And I'm very interested in that because I used to be a nature photographer, and I'm fascinated by birds. I was also always fascinated by their behavior. And one example that always comes to mind is I would always find it frustrating as someone who did wildlife photography. You know, it's very hard to get close to birds a lot of the time. And also, you know, of course, I didn't want to get too close to interact with them if I didn't have to. But the thing that always frustrated me is I would see deer and other wildlife that would be able to walk like right past these birds. But then I would be like 200-300 feet away and instantly scare the birds away. So is that a simple example of the sort of thing that you'd look into, the way they react to humans versus, you know, other stimuli?
Yeah, that's actually the perfect example.
Okay, great.
Honestly, I haven't even thought of it that way.
Oh,
Ironically,
I
because
thought I
that
was
is
going to seem stupid on this. I'm
no,
glad.
it's more simplistic, which I like. Sometimes when you get into this kind of field, you know, you think too complexly, and so you
Right.
need to really bring it down a notch. So yeah, that's actually the perfect example. You know, part of my research has shown that habituation is a big driving factor to those differences that you see. And habituation is where an animal reduces their response to a repeated stimulus,
Uh-huh.
in this case, repeated human stimulus over a period of time. And they reduce their response to that human because they learn that the human no longer poses a threat. And some of that can be innate, which means they're born with that behavior. And that could be, with other wildlife species.
Right.
There's no reason for them to fear a deer because, they know that the deer is not going to do anything to them. But a human is kind of a newer thing, especially to animals that live in rural areas because they don't come in contact with humans all the time.
Right.
So that's why we're potentially seeing these behavioral differences is because
Interesting.
of habituation. And that's just one potential factor.
Sure. So is it through evolution that they are used to deer versus humans that are much more recent to North America? Like, is that an accurate way to look at it?
So, evolution by definition means a genetic change that's occurred due to, specific pressures over a long period of time.
Uh-huh.
So, for it to be true evolution, it would have to be some form of genetic difference
I see.
between, yeah, or something that's changing genetically. However, it could be something of that sort. There are studies that have looked at that specifically, and some have found genetic differences in urban and rural populations, and then some have not. So it just really depends. And when you find those genetic differences, it's probably going to be on species that change rapidly or that would evolve rapidly, such
Uh-huh.
as like bacteria and things like
Where it's
that.
constant reproduction, rapid
Hmm.
reproduction.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's what
Ver-
they've seen so far. But, there's always potential for that genetic change, which is something that I'm curious about for future studies.
Very interesting. So, is that what your research is? The focus of your research has to do with this interaction with humans in particular? Is that what it's based around?
Yeah, so my master's thesis, I looked at what drives boldness in
Uh,
urban and rural song sparrows. And so boldness is where um, they lack fear towards humans. And so that would be if you approached a bird and it didn't fly away, or it took a very long time to fly away.
right.
So, that would be kind of a example. Let's see, like the Carolina chickadee,
Uh,
those are really common bird feeder birds. And so they're less fearful of humans, and you can get really close to them in comparison to like a yellow-billed cuckoo, which is super elusive and, you know,
right.
flies away really quickly.
That's
So
interesting.
yeah, so for my project, that's what I looked at is how habituation, so me approaching these birds every single day for 5 days, how that influences their boldness. And so I found that with me approaching urban and rural song sparrows every day for 5 days, that they became more bold as the study persisted. And then by the end of 5 days, I couldn't tell a difference between the urban and rural song sparrow
Really?
boldness. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it shows that habituation can occur very quickly.
Yeah, 5 days does not seem. I thought you were gonna say 5 months or something like that. 5 days seems like a very short period of time. Were
Yeah,
Were
for
you
sure.
surprised with how quick it happened? Were you expecting that, or?
So I based my study on a previous study in burrowing owls, and it's the author's name is Cavalli. So they found habituation occurred in 9 days in burrowing owls, and so I kind of had an idea, and I was hoping that I could even do it quicker because if you do it in less amount of time, you're in the field for less amount of time.
Right.
So I tried 5 days just to see, and after a couple of weeks, I found that 5 days was significant to see an interaction. So,
Wow. So
yeah.
what is this in practice? What does this look like? Are you setting up like a bird feeder in the woods and then just standing near it, or how does it work hands on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I actually measured flight initiation distance,
Uh,
and that is where you approach a focal bird and then measure the distance at which it took flight. So, in fear of you. And to do this, I mapped territories of song sparrows because they
oh,
kind
okay.
of, they'll live in the same bush or same area, and they'll pretty much sing from the same tree limb or at the top of a
Right.
certain part of the bush. So it was really easy to distinguish between the song sparrows by their territory. So I just mapped their territories and then every morning approached the different birds for 5 days in a
Wow.
row, and then just kind of I did a lot of preparing for it. So I was very aware of what 25 meters actually looks like because that's the distance I started
Uh,
approaching them to keep
right.
it, all the variables very consistent.
Right.
So yeah, so I just approached them and then measured the distance at which they took flight and then the height of the object that they were perched on. So that so if you think about it, there was me right here and then the bird here. And then I was able to calculate the hypotenuse of the
Oh, I remember
triangle.
that from school.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
you
you do
you do
use
use
it.
it.
Oh man,
hmm
I swore I'd never use it.
Yeah, so that gave me my overall flight initiation distance, which
Interesting.
conferred boldness in my
Right.
study. So,
So there's a lot. It seems like there's a lot of variables that go into it because that is something I have
yes.
noticed. When a bird's higher up in a tree, you might be able to walk right underneath them and they don't seem to care. But certainly a lower branch and they take off immediately, or on the ground, they're even jumpier. Do the birds know that they have an advantage when they're in a tree that we can't do? Like, do they understand that humans aren't going to be able to leap into a tree the same way like a I don't know, a fox or a bobcat or something? Are they that
Yeah.
are they aware of that?
Yeah, they are. They're, something such as evolution has made them aware over many, many years that
Right.
they that they can be 20 feet above you in the tree, and they know that you're not going to be able to hop up there and get them because they've learned that. And
Right.
part of it, I think, is passed down through genetics, and then part of it has to do with like active learning.
Just
So,
seeing us and how, yeah. It's interesting you mentioned chickadees before because I used to live in Connecticut and my neighbor, this older woman, would feed chickadees by hand in her backyard.
yep.
So yeah, she originally had a bird feeder set up by her porch, and then I don't know how it happened, but by the time I was, 5, she would have me over, and I would sit there with bird seed in my hand, and they land right in your hand as long as you stayed still enough. So I guess that'd be a extreme example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. hmm
Now, while we're on that subject, what are your thoughts on people doing stuff like that? Is that, from an ethical standpoint, is it bad
Yeah.
to get wildlife that used to people?
Yes, because I love to do it. I understand the desire to
Right,
want
right.
to feel, that connection with
Sure.
wildlife. But the problem with that is you are teaching them that humans don't pose a threat. And
Sure.
although you individually may not pose a threat, your neighbor may be outside and the chickadee may be confused and land on the neighbor's head, and then
Right.
the
Yeah, get
neighbor squash
hurt.
it.
Right.
So yeah, it's one of those things that you can't, even in wildlife rehab, that's something that's really important is you don't want to habituate the
Get
animal
them.
before
Yeah.
you release it. And, so it may seem harmless when it's just, you're like, oh, it's just me with one or two birds. But if
Right, right.
everyone goes out and starts doing that, then that's when
Yeah.
you start to see a
You create a
problem.
real problem. Yeah.
Yeah,
Suddenly
there's
you're walking down the street and 20 birds are landing on you.
exactly. There's millions of people in the United States. So
Right,
just think
right.
of the possibilities of how many people could actually be
Yeah,
doing that.
really spiral out of control quick. So, with your research, is there a specific end goal in mind? Do you have a specific? I know you're answering the specific question, but does this translate into a specific action that you will then take, or is this research for the sake of curiosity?
With science and with especially wildlife biology research, I think that there's always a reason, even if it may not seem it.
Right.
A lot of times we may do things to ask a question that people may say, well, why are you asking that question? But it can sometimes tie into a overarching, like more important question. And I think that my research specifically ties in with even humans. What about the behavioral differences between humans that live in urban and rural areas? And by
Interesting.
studying songbirds and wildlife, and by seeing, what's going on with their behavioral changes, then we might be able to better understand human differences. And it's also important, in terms of wildlife and conservation. So, learning how urbanization is going to affect species is so important because, song sparrows are a perfect example of a songbird that can thrive in urban habitat as well as rural. And so they're truly urban exploiters and they do really well. But there's not a lot of species, that potentially are capable of doing that. Like I said, the yellow-billed cuckoo, they're so elusive and they stress very, very easily. Like owls, things like that, species like that. They just, it's something that needs to be considered.
Right. Well, it is interesting because you go into towns and cities, and it seems like you're only seeing four or five different types of birds. But then you go into a nature park somewhere, you're walking through the woods, and you're not seeing birds as often. But once you do, you're seeing birds that most people haven't seen before.
Yeah.
Especially when you're near water or different environments. So that's very interesting. I'm always concerned. I don't know if you've ever been on these websites where you can see the tally of the human population just going up and up and up per second, but it always makes me nervous for wildlife because the more people, the more we're going to be spreading out. So I am always concerned about, what all these animals are going to do, especially the ones that have trouble adapting. And like you said, certain birds just don't adapt well. What does the Is that included in your research at all? What does the future look like for birds that aren't handling our cities and our towns as well?
Yeah, so there's multiple things that could be happening to these birds. It's obviously species specific, but a big thing about it is that we might be seeing a loss in behavioral diversity as well
Mm,
as species diversity because once, it might create a barrier. Urbanization might become this barrier that certain species cannot cross because they don't survive in urban habitat. And if that
right.
happens, then we might see increasing habitat fragmentation where birds aren't able to cross a kind of invisible barrier, meaning that they won't be able to breed with different populations.
Mm,
And so there's so many different consequences, and then also just a huge loss of species. And
right.
so yeah, it's something that I think is not addressed enough, especially in politics. And that's something that I think is really important that we need to focus on is what are we going to do with wildlife as we slowly take over all these
Right.
natural landscapes, like
Right.
what's going to happen and what are the bigger impacts, because you lose one species and you may think it's not that big of a deal, oh, it's just one species, but they're all interconnected.
Well, I think that's an important thing to consider. Even if a bug dies out, suddenly that bug's not there to be food for another animal. It snowballs so quick. And even for people who don't quote unquote care about wildlife, I think it's important for people to keep in mind, even from a more selfish standpoint, anytime a species is affected, in the end we get screwed over too. Humans
Mm-hmm.
end up getting negatively affected. I mean, you look at the population decline of something like bees, and then crops having issues. It's just everything's connected, and we're so separate from nature at this point as humans, as we've moved indoors and we don't we're not out in the woods as often. I don't think people think about it as much as they should. It's such an important thing, and so many people, I don't even think it remotely crosses their mind.
Yeah.
So I think it's something I'm hoping to get people to realize with this podcast. So I'm glad we're talking about it. What are Do you have a solution's a strong word? Do you have suggestions? If politicians, let's say the president was coming to ask you what we should do, would
I
you
wish.
have, yeah, right? Would you have any general suggestions that you'd offer in particular?
Broadly, when it comes to policy, I think there needs to be more policy on protection of natural areas and preservation of natural areas, and more funding for research to find out what are the specific things that are important for these species. So,
Right.
I keep saying the yellow-billed cuckoo, but what is it that species needs potentially in an urban environment to help it thrive?
uh,
So that would be policy wise, but as an individual I think people can keep their backyards more natural and encourage natural environments that are safe for birds, and lots of trees, lots of leaf litter for them to
right.
forage, and that would just encourage an increased number of species in your yard. But when it comes to habituation, that is a very tricky one because, I looked at students who walk across a college campus and pass by the same bird every single day.
Hmm.
That you can't really help walking by a bird. You can't really help doing that. And so, of course, we're going to have some natural impact that we can't really control. But I think just being aware of what our behavior can do and trying to, I don't know, I guess just encourage more coexistence rather
Right.
than just like bulldozing through.
Yeah, that does seem to be the human strategy sometimes. Just anything on our way, we push out. I'm glad you mentioned the lawn stuff. I recently did an episode on front lawns and how bad so many of the things that we do are for it,
Yeah.
for the environment, between pesticides and herbicides and just chopping down all the trees and raking all the leaves. And it's amazing how all these things that we never think of. I mean, I've been fascinated by environmental and nature things for years now, and front lawns didn't even cross my mind until a year or two ago. So it's all of these things where we're just on autopilot so often, I feel like, as humans, where the standard thing is we're doing what we've always done. And I think it's clear a lot of the time what we've always done as a species is maybe not the best for nature.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah, I think it's just good for us to literally examine every single thing we do and make sure you got to really step back, especially from it emotionally, not get defensive about what we do. There's no harm in, well, there's harm, but it's understandable. There's no harm in doing something that we didn't know better. It's once you know better, though, you have to do better. And this definitely seems like an issue with wildlife, where it's something where we're all going to have to come together. A handful of scientists aren't going to be able to solve this in a lab somewhere. This is something that's going to require all of us to do our part. I'd say with pretty much everything involving the environment and nature. I like what you talked about with the lawns because it's something practical people can do. Because a lot of talk of nature and the environment, that everyone starts to think, I'm just one person, what can I possibly
Yeah.
do? But it's these little steps that all at once you have billions of people doing it, it makes such a huge difference. So you mentioned the lawns, more. Would you say just having more trees in general is an automatic win? Not cutting down trees in your yard if possible.
Yeah.
Um,
Native plants,
yeah, I was gonna
planting
say, yeah,
all
native.
native plants, doing things that encourage, insect populations,
Hmm.
things like that, because that's another issue is food shortages for,
Right.
food and water shortages. And that's one of the huge reasons why we saw the mass die-offs in California and Mexico. And
Right.
so, yeah.
Something I saw recently too. Did you see the pictures of, I can't remember what country it was, but just streets filled with dead birds from fireworks going off?
Ugh, yeah, yeah, that's another thing. Fireworks. I mean, anything that like, if you really think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then for a second, well, what would the bird in my tree think
Right.
about what I'm doing? So if you want to spray your lawn for pesticides, that kills the insects that the bird's going to eat.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, all these things, and that's the sort of thing, like fireworks. People don't even think of fireworks. It's just so ingrained in human nature at this point that everyone's just so excited to do them. But I have seen, people working on silent fireworks and things like that. So maybe there's a way around to make everyone happy. But maybe in the
yeah.
meantime, until they figure that out, we can all just slow down with fireworks a little bit. I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
don't mess with fireworks.
no, I mean it's 2 seconds of joy for us, but then potential death for another animal. It doesn't sound like it's worth it to me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and another big thing, outdoor cats.
Yes, that is true.
Outdoor cats, they're like the number one reason, one of the number one reasons for species loss, specifically in birds.
Are they?
Yeah.
So these sorts of things that we're talking about, have you does any of your research get into these topics at all, or are you narrowly focused on the human interaction?
So when, you're doing research for a university or something like that, you kind of have to be very narrow, and focus on the main topics that, you're researching, just because you're trying to get published. And you want to be clear and concise so that way your point is made. But when I'm conducting my research, I read, you know, hundreds of scientific articles written by other people who talk about the same things, but a lot of times, their research is unique in their own way.
Uh,
So I do read a lot on this topic in general.
right.
So that's kind of how, I get the knowledge from it. I may not specifically look at
Right.
cats and their effects on birds, but through my research,
Yeah. That
yeah.
makes sense. That makes sense. So, as far as the cats go, because I have heard about that before, they've wiped out entire species, right? They
Mhm.
attribute that to house cats.
Yes.
So, what do you think? I mean, I feel like the obvious solution is for people to keep cats inside. I know
Yeah.
we have cats here. We've closed in our front porch so they can get outside, and have, an area where they can get outdoors but not be able to interact with wildlife. Do you feel like it's as simple as that? People just need to keep their cats inside, pretty much.
Yeah, not only for the birds, but for the cats
Right,
too.
right.
I mean, it's so dangerous out there for
It
cats. They
is.
can get all types of, diseases, respiratory viruses, rabies, feline herpes,
Right,
all that stuff. And then, they can be hit by cars, attacked by other animals. So that's a huge thing for the cat. So, if you care about your cat, it is nice to let them go out because you're thinking, oh, it's more natural. They get to,
right,
get all this time outside. But in reality, cats are domesticated animals that we bred solely for the purpose of, you know, um, having a companion.
right,
So
right.
they're meant to be indoor animals.
Yeah,
And so I mean, they're even worse than dogs when it comes to
right,
being outside, and that, you can't keep a dog inside like you can a cat. So,
right, right.
but yeah, it's just cats really should be inside because they kill a lot of birds.
They do. It's terrible. And like you said, I know people mean well with it. Same thing with feeding wild bird. There's a whole lot of situations where humans mean well and don't do well by accident. And I can
Yeah.
understand how frustrating that can be for people. And I can also understand if you're a listener right now and you feel yourself getting a little defensive. I've gotten defensive too at times because you think, I've only meant well, and then you start to feel backed into a corner. But it's one of those things where we all do things that we later on learn weren't the best, and then you just adapt and grow.
Exactly. I used to let my cat outside. So it's in no way, shaming or anything
Right,
like
right.
that. It's just that it's sad, the sad facts.
Right, right, absolutely. And like I said, if your cat, if you have a cat that just loves being outside, maybe you can fence in a small area. Obviously, it's much more
Hmm.
difficult for cats since they can climb and jump stuff. So you gotta really plan that out thoroughly. But um, yeah, there are options. It doesn't, especially if your cat's been used to being outside, suddenly having them locked inside all the time. Maybe you can find a middle ground where, yeah, you just fence in an area or fence in a porch or something like that. It doesn't have to be, yeah, 100% shift like that. But is another example of all these small changes where when we all work together, it makes a huge difference. And another aspect you said with the cats too is cats getting killed by other wildlife. And I know
Hmm.
I have seen way too many times, especially where I am in the middle of the country, where people will post in like local Facebook groups that my cat or my small dog got killed by a coyote, and suddenly everyone out here thinks there's some vigilante warrior going out into the woods with their
Hmm.
guns to try to, I guess, exterminate the entire coyote population. I don't know what the game plan is, to be honest. I'm always very
Yeah.
confused, but yeah, that's a whole nother
Which is
situation.
also not effective.
You're
If
right.
anyone's wondering,
It doesn't
killing
make,
coyotes isn't effective.
yeah, no, it doesn't make any sense. All right, so one thing I have noticed is when in towns and cities, if you're in like a little park or something like that, it seems like there's a ton of wildlife. Like the ideal
Hmm.
situation for a nature photographer, you'd think would be to go out deep into some nature park that's hundreds and hundreds of acres. But the reality is, once you get out there, it's hard to find animals. But if you go into a park in the center of a town that's just a couple acres, it seems like there's wildlife everywhere. So first, is that accurate, or am I noticing something that seems accurate? Are they all condensing into this park because they have nowhere else to go? Is that the sort of situation you think?
It could be a combination of a lot of different things. So, it could be depending on, if you're looking for a certain species, then you could go into that park and probably never find, a certain warbler or something that you may be looking for. But if you go into the woods in an area that is a certain elevation for that bird, then
Right.
you'd be more likely to find it. But so you may see more species diversity in the woods if the forest if you go out there, but
Right.
maybe more diversity, less abundance. And then
Right.
within
Right.
parks, you might see, less diversity and more abundance because that is, when I was talking about habitat fragmentation earlier, that is an issue. And if you go miles and miles and miles of city and there's no trees or bushes or anything, or water supplies, then you're not going to see a lot of wildlife. But if all of a sudden there's a park, kind of like Central Park in New York,
Right.
then that's kind of like a stopover place for a lot of these birds, especially during migration.
Right. Interesting. So, for people who, you mentioned if you have a yard, steps you can take. Is there anything, if we have anyone listening that's in a city, like smack dab in the middle of the city, that wants to do their part, is there anything someone could do that like lives in an apartment? Would their best thing to be, because I know if you don't have a yard, you're kind of running out of options. You think their best bet would be to look for like a wildlife rehab place to volunteer at or something like that?
Yeah, I know firsthand that wildlife rehab places always need people to volunteer,
Right.
always, always, always. And I think wildlife rehab centers are understudied, and there hasn't been a lot of research to see the impact that they have on wildlife communities. However, when I used to work at one, I know that we would rehab over 3,000 songbirds in the summer. So I believe that definitely has a significant impact. So volunteering at any animal shelters, even dog and cat shelters, because those animals, if
I
they're
didn't even think
out,
of that.
on the streets, those are going to impact species. But yeah, if you're living, in a city, that does make it difficult for sure. But if you could find places to volunteer, or even I know places like Asheville do river cleanups. So even though you may live somewhere that's surrounded by concrete, you could drive 10 minutes and do a river cleanup.
That's true. I didn't even
So
think of that. It doesn't have to be hands on with the birds themselves. It can be hands on with the environment that the birds live in.
yeah, exactly. Or, if you have a porch to plant flowers or things like that to attract bees. And so, anything that you can really think of, or even just picking up the trash that you see. I know with the coronavirus right now, so you don't want to touch things that,
Right.
but if you bring some gloves with you or whatever, and just like on one weekend a month, go pick up trash somewhere. Just
Yeah.
think, if there's 336 million people in the United States, what if half of us did that?
Right.
We
Right.
would have a clean planet,
Yeah.
because most of us don't, even myself. I've done that a couple times, but not as much as I should.
Right. I think we'll notice there's a common trend, which is if we all work together, these little steps suddenly add up real quick. I'm glad you mentioned the coronavirus because I keep seeing these articles and pictures where animals are tangled in masks that people have just like thrown on the ground. So that's something I keep hearing about. Another small step if you're using disposable surgical masks to cut the strings, ear loops, whatever you call them. Any little step people can take, it really does add up. If we all do our part, we've seen that the opposite doesn't work. If we all don't do our part, it doesn't go well. But if we all do our
Yeah,
part, it can really go well.
exactly.
This might be a little. I think you kind of touched on this before. This might be a little off topic. This is more just for my own curiosity. But you talked about how certain birds are, I don't know what the right term is, jumpier than other birds. So I've noticed,
Mhm.
this is something I've always noticed my whole life that always confused me because I always assume the bigger an animal, the braver they're going to be. Because I don't know, they just talk about that. If a big animal charges you, you're supposed to look as big as possible for certain ones. But
Mhm.
why is it that I see birds like herons and hawks and turkey vultures, and they seem jumpier than the smaller birds?
Typically, and this is not always, the bigger the brain, the more intelligent that
Right.
individual is. So they might be able to, see a human as more of a threat because they perceive it
Interesting.
differently.
Right.
That's something that I'm potentially going to be uh, furthering my research on in my PhD lab is kind of looking at cognition and the awareness of these individuals and how
Right.
they can differentiate between, can they differentiate between humans, and recognize that like I'm a good human and this human that walked towards me and yelled 5 times is not a good human,
Yeah,
So,
right.
but yeah, it could be uh, cognition, but there's just so many different things that could
So many
impact it.
variables, sure.
Yeah, but they could just be like, I don't want to be bothered.
Right, right, right.
And they're just, they're more intelligent to be able to say, I don't want to be bothered and fly
Right,
away,
right.
you know.
So you're mentioning birds recognizing different people potentially. I remember, I think it was like a mini documentary I watched on crows that was fascinating, and how like, crows are wildly intelligent, right? They're considered
Yes.
like one of the smarter. A lot of people don't know, a lot of people think dolphins, chimps, but yeah, it turns out crows are up there too with some of the stuff
Mm-hmm.
I've seen. Something about they've been able to, I think it was crows that have been able to understand traffic lights, and that they can drop nuts and seeds in a roadway and wait for the cars to crush them, and then wait for the red light to come and pick up their food after. Like, that's incredible. Like, most human children wouldn't know to do that.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
this sort of stuff fascinates me. Before, you mentioned trying to get published, and you hear that that's a term we hear a lot from people in the science fields. Can you explain what that means? Because I don't even fully understand what that means. I hear it all the time. I get confused.
No, it's okay. I mean, a lot of this is new to me too.
Right.
I got my undergrad at UNC Asheville, and I had never really known what publishing was. I knew what a scientific article was, but I just knew it was a paper that was really difficult to read because it was
Right.
over my head.
Right. Right.
But when I went and got my master's at Western Carolina University, I started to kind of learn a little bit more about that. So basically, there are multiple scientific journals, and these journals are online.
Uh,
Some of them, if they're older, they might have had a print form. But yeah, so they are online databases. So
okay.
it's almost like Google, but for a specific scientific topic.
Right.
So, for example, ethology. Ethology is behavior. So, if you want to submit your work to ethology, then your work needs to be obviously animal behavior,
Mm,
and you have to have your paper reviewed by multiple reviewers, which are typically people that work at universities, PhDs, professors, all that. And they'll review your work, send it back, make you make edits,
uh,
and then you eventually will hopefully get accepted into their journal where they will publish your work online. And
okay.
so right now, my master's work is published,
Uh,
and but it's a kind of like open access free publishing website that you get when you graduate from Western Carolina University. So it's kind of like, it's not one of the big journals,
sure.
but that's kind of how that works. So if you go on Google Scholar,
Uh,
those are all scientific publications. And some of them are, open access where you don't have to pay to read them, but then a lot of them you have to pay or be a member of the journal. So it can be
interesting.
very gatekeepy,
Right. Right.
you
Sure.
know. But yeah, it's one of those things that, if someone's working for a university, and especially has their PhD and a postdoc and all that, their main goal is to publish, and especially at a research university. And so the more publications you have, the better, pretty much.
Interesting. So
Yeah. So
when people look those up, are these? I'm always so cautious when I tell people to research stuff because I want to make sure they do their proper fact checking. Are these papers? Is it something where you have to be as concerned as if you just Google anything else as far as accuracy of the information, or is it typically? Are you typically pretty safe when you look at these papers?
So these are the papers you want to be reading.
Okay.
This is the research you want to be doing. So
Good.
when,
Good.
when people try to say, well, I did research, and then they
Yeah.
went on YouTube and
Some guy in a pickup truck.
Yeah, exactly. It's anyone can post that on YouTube, but
Right.
not anyone can
Okay.
post in a, scientific journal. I mean, these go through multiple reviewers and people that have read it, and you have to submit your data. So they can, if they wanted to, they could look at your data and say, wait, this
Yeah, this doesn't
doesn't
add up.
correlate. Yeah.
Right,
So
right.
there it's what you want to be reading. So that's
Awesome.
why if you ever have any topic you want to learn more about, I would just go on Google Scholar and type that in, because Google Scholar is going to actually be, the scientific
That's excellent. Because
research.
that is something I have trouble with as I research, my solo podcast episodes. It's so hard to know what to believe, especially if it's like, more of a fun like magazine, like Better Homes and Garden. I'm like, how do I don't know for sure this is accurate. I'm sure it's not malicious, but did they fact check enough? So that sort of thing. So I'm glad to hear that's a safe place to go. Is there anything else you'd recommend for people that are super interested in this subject? Anything from like a documentary to a book, or mostly, just look on Google Scholar and stuff like that?
Only downfall to Google Scholar is a lot of it is meant for scientists to read
Hmm.
it.
Right.
So, that can be it can be intimidating for sure,
Right.
for even myself. I can pretty much read, behavior type of articles now and get the gist. But if I tried to read something on cancer research,
Right.
I can understand it to an extent, but it's still, they use a lot of terminology that's difficult. So, be wary with that. But yeah, most of the research that I've read has been just on Google, on these different databases.
Yeah.
I can't think of any. Oh, well, I'm gonna spotlight David Attenborough.
Mm.
His
Yeah. You like
all of
him?
those, yeah, the Blue Planet and all that, especially the most recent one, talks a lot about just, these types of things: animal behavior, species loss, the effects of humans on wildlife,
Oh, really?
and
Awesome.
potentially like what we could be seeing in our future. It's really impactful. So a lot of all of honestly all of the David Attenborough narrated ones, but
Right.
the Blue Planets are my favorite ones.
Yeah, those are good too because while a lot of it will go over children, the heads of children, they won't be able to understand it as well. It's still, yeah, it's visually entertaining enough that it's a way to get kids interested in animals, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, and on like National Geographic, they sometimes are not always accurate.
Oh, really?
I've watched some things where they'll say this is a whooping swan, and I'm like, that's a mute swan. But
Really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's interesting. So, there's always going to be errors and things
Yeah.
like that, especially if it's, not peer reviewed over and over and over.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, on Saturdays and Sundays, they have great, the info and like informative TV shows that I like to watch, which, if you anything you can learn about wildlife, I think will just help you in the long run make better informed
Yeah,
decisions.
absolutely. I think the more you understand animals, the more you understand that they're also, feeling, living, breathing creatures that feel pain just like we do, and that,
Mm-hmm.
you start to realize they deserve the same amount of respect that, your human neighbor does. Just because a bird lives in a tree doesn't mean they should be treated any differently. And in fact,
Yeah.
the birds around here are a lot nicer than my neighbors, so I respect them more, actually. I think this has been a great talk. I just want to quickly summarize the steps people can take themselves to have an impact, because I think that's always an important thing, because people get overwhelmed so easily, myself included, so I get that. So, as with my earlier podcast episode I did, having the most environmentally friendly lawn is a huge one, right?
Yes.
Native plants.
Mm-hmm.
Try not to, no herbicides, pesticides. Just let nature do its thing. Nature has
Yeah,
it figured out. We don't need to control nature. Nature's got it.
exactly. Just do things to encourage,
Right.
a more natural environment.
And like I said in my earlier episode too, if you need like a mowed, groomed area because you have a dog or you have kids or something. It doesn't have to be your whole lawn. Like our yard was like 2.5 acres here. We didn't even walk on half of it. So we let most of it go back. We have an area mowed for the dogs. We have an area we can walk when we need to, but the rest, nature's taken back. Wildflowers are popping up. Bees are loving it. Birds are loving it. It's the easiest, most lazy thing that you can. It's not often that the lazy thing is also the good thing to do.
Yeah.
So enjoy it while you can. Let
Exactly.
nature do its thing.
Yeah.
And
And if
then,
HOA has something bad to say, just say, I'm saving the birds.
right there you go. Yep. And then we mentioned cats. Keep cats inside.
Yes.
Maybe get a little fenced in area for cats.
A cat tree in the window.
Yeah,
That's helpful.
absolutely, absolutely. Thoughts on bird feeders? Bird feeders, good or bad?
Bird feeders, I think are good
Mm,
to an extent. You don't want to obviously overfeed and
right,
have, hundreds of bird feeders in your backyard. Because I do know people that do that, and I think it
right,
can be excessive. Um, but if you're going to have bird feeders, keep them in an area that won't put the birds at greater risk for predation.
uh,
So you don't want it to be, right next to a place where there's a hawk that sits in your
right,
backyard,
right.
um, or right next to, if you do have cats, where your cats can get to them,
Sure,
things like that.
right.
So the awareness, and also cleaning your bird feeders
Mm.
once a week with a 10% diluted bleach and water solution.
Oh, that's good to know.
That's and let it dry out before you hang them back up. But yeah, once a week, there is a toxin called mycoplasma that is affecting house finches and
Oh, wow.
making them very sick, and that travels through bird feeders.
Oh, geez. So would
Yeah.
the same thing go for bird baths if people wanted to do that? Just
Hmm.
keep them clean.
Yeah, just keep them clean.
Pay attention to the location again.
Exactly. Yeah. No hand feeding birds.
Right, right. As much as you want to.
Yep. Even the ducks at the lake, don't feed them bread.
Right. Yes. Yes.
All that good stuff. They can find food.
Basically, what it all always comes down to is think about the way the bird would be behaving if you were not there, and then if you're going to do something, try to make it as natural as possible.
Yeah.
So yeah, birds don't bake bread, so no bread.
They
Something we
probably
didn't.
wish they could.
Yeah, probably. Something we didn't touch on at all. We mentioned the wildlife rehab places, but if someone finds an injured bird, it's almost always best to take the bird to a proper facility, right?
Always,
Yes.
always, always. There are so many things about birds that you do not know if you're not a wildlife rehabber. And
Yes.
things you can be doing that you think are beneficial or
Right.
helpful could actually be severely hurting the bird,
Absolutely.
like giving the bird water.
Which
If
I
you're,
know is always anytime I find an injured animal, I'm like, they need water now.
you could put it next to them,
Just don't.
because you
Yeah.
don't force them. Don't
Right.
give it in an eyedropper.
Pour it in their
Don't
mouth. Yeah.
pet the animal. The animal does not, it's wildlife. Cats are reassured by being pet. Dogs are
Right.
reassured by being pet. Wildlife are not. That's
Right. Yeah.
terrifying.
Right now, there's what's the equivalent of like a 200-foot giant petting them
Yeah.
that they think is about to eat them, probably.
Exactly. They'd normally fly away from you.
Right.
So if they're not coming for your pets,
Right.
for,
Right.
then
Right.
they, so
Yeah.
yeah, definitely, take the bird to a wild, or any animal, put it in a warm, dark place, like a empty shoebox,
Mhm.
and bring them to a wildlife rehabber. And that's the best thing you could do.
And then the last thing we mentioned with hands-on is just cleaning up the environment in general, right? People in
Hmm.
cities that can't, make their lawn, if they don't have a lawn, they can't make their lawn more eco-friendly. Just helping clean up areas, clean up parks, all that sort of good stuff, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Just, if you see trash, just put on a glove, pick it up, and toss it. And, just things like that. The simple things that I think we all think are just, oh, they won't make a difference. But because we're all thinking they won't make a difference, they're not making a difference.
Right,
But,
right.
if we all collectively started doing those things, river volunteer for river cleanups or different things like that.
Absolutely perfect. And there's one last thing that I can't believe I almost forgot to talk to you about. That is baby birds falling out of nests. What is the proper thing to do? Because I know there's a lot of myths going around about that.
Yeah. So, uh, one, most birds, not all, do not have good sensory, organs. They are
Uh-huh.
olfactory. They can't smell.
Right,
Obviously, vultures and certain species can, but they are not going to reject the baby
right,
if they smell like humans. So if you find a bird on the ground and they seem not like they're not bleeding, they don't, clearly have a broken wing,
right,
then just put it back in the nest.
right.
And then keep an eye on the nest. And if the mom comes back, then it should be fine. Another good trick is to look at the stomach of the bird.
Uh-huh.
And if you flip the baby over and look at its stomach, the stomach should be like, like your skin, nice and soft, not dry
Right.
and cracky,
Oh,
not,
interesting.
crinkly and dehydrated looking. Because if it is, then that means the bird is probably not getting the proper care or it's sick. So then you would want to take it in.
Right,
But that's a good indicator. A healthy
right.
baby bird should have a nice, shiny little, healthy looking stomach. But um, one that is not getting fed or properly cared for will look a little crusty.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. I didn't even know that second part. I just knew that, yeah, I don't know where that, do you know where that myth came from that you can't touch baby birds?
There's so many different myths out there, like frogs give you warts or toads give
Yeah.
you warts. That's not true.
I feel like they're all left over from like thousands of years ago, but who knows?
Yeah, they could be. I mean, frogs have warts, but those aren't warts, they're poison glands. So,
Right.
it's if you have questions, you can always, always, always call a wildlife rehabber
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah.
before you do anything because it doesn't hurt to ask for, someone's informed opinion.
Yeah, and even if you don't have a situation with an animal right now, uh, it's a great idea to just be aware of the closest wildlife rehab place because when you're in a panic and you find an injured bird outside and you don't know what to do and your adrenaline's going, that's not when you want to be flipping through Google trying to find the closest place. So it's good to just, you have 911 memorized. It's also good to know a couple of other numbers or websites, just in case anything happens so that you're prepared.
Yep. Just Google wildlife rehabbers near me. And there's typically, they'll pop up with a list. And my name even is on some lists still. So I get phone calls
Oh, do you
sometimes.
really? Wow.
But I like it because I can direct them to someone that can
Yeah.
help them.
No,
So
that's good.
yeah.
Yes. And once again, just so everyone remembers this, because I see this on social media so often, finding an injured wild animal is not an exciting time for you to get a new exotic pet. You need to send
No.
these animals to the proper places.
Yes, it is illegal, actually. Not
Yeah.
for all species, but for almost most of them, it's illegal. And you could be bringing disease and all that
Yeah.
into your house. So just
Let the
never do it.
professionals handle it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I had a really good time with this
Yeah,
conversation.
me too. It was good.
Yeah, I feel like we covered a lot of topics. I hope you'll be back on at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to be. I'm sure I'm going to, at Virginia Tech have all these new experiences and new things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last thing I just wanted to ask you was what is the name of your study for people that want to learn more about your research?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more, you can go on Google and it's called ProQuest is the journal I published in. And the title of my research is The Effects of Habituation on Boldness of Urban and Rural Song Sparrows. And then their scientific name, which is Melaspisa melodia. So, which you probably could do it without the scientific name and still find it. So,
Perfect. Perfect. And so people know what they're getting into. Is that something that everyone would be able to somewhat understand your study, or is it just for people that are scientists basically?
I'm a new scientist. I'm new
Right.
to scientific writing. So I would say that mine is a little bit more simpler to understand than maybe, other studies. So, yeah, especially if you read the introduction, that's going to tell you the background information, which is kind of what I talked about today.
Perfect.
And yeah, but the abstract kind of summarizes it. So, if you don't
Awesome.
want to read the whole thing, then just read the abstract.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, where can people follow you at?
My social media handle is Tay Fossett 13. So it's Tayy, and my last name Fossett, Fossett 13. So it should
Perfect.
be that for Twitter and Instagram. And those have my private life, but they also have my work on them as well. I talk a lot about animals and always try to do some fun bird recordings. So, yeah.
Awesome. When did you say you are working on your PhD? That's coming up soon, right?
Yeah, so I should be moving to Virginia in April to start field work to help out the other members that are going to be in my lab with their data collection. And then that way I can kind of get a head start on my PhD, but it doesn't
Awesome.
start until August 10th.
Well, that's
So,
exciting though. Moving your way
yeah,
up.
yes, that's the plan.
Well, good luck with everything. Thanks for joining
Thank you.
us.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.